Welcome to the ANEW Insight podcast, empowering and inspiring your journey to optimal health. Hosted by Dr. Supatra Tovar, clinical psychologist, registered dietitian, fitness expert, and author of Deprogrammed Diet Culture. Rethink your relationship with food, heal your mind, and live a diet-free life. And Chantal Donnelly, physical therapist and author of Settled, How to Find Calm in a Stress-Inducing World. We follow our guests' journey to optimal health, providing you with the keys to unlock your own wellness path. Tune in and evolve with us.
Welcome back, everyone, to the ANEW Insight podcast. We are here for the second half of our interview with author and businessman David Moerlein. David gave us some background on what inspired him to leave his 15-year job at Google and write a book called The Safety Effect. And in this follow-up episode, we're really looking forward to learning more about from David, what psychological safety can do for us in our lives, for ourselves and for our loved ones and for those we work with. So welcome back, David. So good to see you again.
Thank you.
So in our last section, you shared with us that psychological safety in the workplace creates more success in the workplace. And you also note in your book that mistakes are really important stepping stones to success. Give us a picture of why mistakes are so important and what kind of role they play in the workplace.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I hear this question, I get this image in my head of standing on a stage in an auditorium where there's 1,000 people just sitting out there, and I just ask them to raise their hand. Anybody raise their hand if you have never made a mistake at work. How many hands do you think you would see?
None. Of course, everybody's made a mistake.
And I think it would, Chantal, I saw you lean in. Go ahead.
I'm guessing like 50%, because 50% of the people would be totally ready to say, yes, I made a mistake. And then the other 50% would either be in denial that they made a mistake or they just wouldn't want to talk about it.
So interesting. Okay. Supatra, I was imagining, and Chantal, I really appreciate that. So I think then it leads to a conversation. So if you have zero, and I would hope that most people would be self-aware enough to know that they probably have made a mistake at some point in their career. And then it would probably apply to 10,000 people or 100,000 people in the room. But it's actually a really good call that maybe not everybody would be that self-aware. Maybe half would feel ashamed maybe to say that they've ever made a mistake. And that's a really good point. And then it's worth a conversation around what leads to that fear. Like, why are we afraid of mistakes? Because even if it's 50% of the room, there's a coin flip if you're going to make a mistake or not. It's very common. So since many of us, if admit it or not, have made mistakes in our careers, the biggest difference is how we show up afterwards. How do we respond? In a non-psychologically safe environment, if I make a mistake, I might be really scared to tell people. I might just try to hide it. I might not tell my manager or tell others who might be impacted because I might just kind of hope it goes away. And that could harm me, it could harm the organization, it could harm the team. In a psychologically safe organization aligned to more of a growth mindset, we're much more likely to recognize and acknowledge that mistakes are going to happen. Even if it only happens to half of us, mistakes are going to happen. And it's okay to talk about them. So if I make a mistake in that environment, I'm much more likely, right after I recognize the mistake, to go talk to my manager and say, hey, this just happened. I'm sorry it happened. And how can we best work through it together? And we are more likely then to arrive at a better outcome on the other side. So we might feel the same things in both situations. We might feel embarrassed. We might feel a little bit ashamed. And I think that's kind of normal human response to making a mistake in a public environment. But that response is going to be very different if it's a psychologically safe space where we feel comfortable speaking up and acknowledging it. And then we can actually use that mistake to help others avoid it in the future. So everybody wins again.
Absolutely. And I think, too, it just comes down to, day one training and, how they feel about what the job they're actually doing. And if it's not perfectly clear, a lot of people are afraid to raise their hand and say, wait, I don't really understand how to do this. Can you explain it again? And that leads to the mistakes. So I think that's so important for day one for them to, have that safety to know that you may not remember all of this. You may not have everything down, and it is okay to ask questions, and it is okay to make a mistake, because we know that that's a part of the learning process. And I can tell you, in every psychologically unsafe place that I've ever worked in, that was never said. Never. Wow. And so there was always this culture of fear, like, you better get it right. And if you don't get it right the first time, we're gonna write you up for that. So I think that that's really important.
And can I build on that a little?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you hinted at it some, but that comfort in speaking up and saying, like, I don't remember a process and I forgot what I'm supposed to do next. The leader then plays such a critical role. So if a leader shows up at that moment and reprimands the person and writes them up, similar to what you were describing, that signals to the next person who doesn't know that you don't come to me. We don't talk about these things. You go figure it out on your own.
Yep.
If they had responded in a different way that was accepting and inviting and said, okay, here's where you can find the next step of the process. I'll help guide you through it one time. If needed, we can do it again. Come let me know. That sends a signal to the whole rest of the team that it's okay to speak up and ask, either from the manager or from peers. And it likely would provide a collective sigh of relief where some shoulders might drop and they might feel a little bit more physically relaxed as well. And Chantal, that ties directly into your work, but it would all play together in how they show up. But the leader can play such a key pivotal role when somebody does speak up to determine if others will then follow.
Absolutely.
I think there's some mythology, and I don't even know if it's true, and I'm not sure if Google was involved or if it was a different tech company, but there's a story about a tech company who actually gave raises or extra time off, or it was some sort of benefit to the teams that were making mistakes to kind of really support those who wanted to, because they were looking for people to be creative, and in being creative and creating new paths, you end up making more mistakes. And so I wish it might have been Apple. I can't remember which company this was and if it's even a true story, but I don't know if you know that.
I don't know the tech company, but in one of Amy Edmondson's great books, she calls out that what they discovered when she discovered psychological safety as a phenomenon and began to pursue it for her career. One of the things that led her down that path was when she found, I believe it was in the medical field, the teams that made the most mistakes, the teams that were the most successful and had the most successful outcomes. And it was not that they necessarily made more mistakes, but they acknowledged them and they talked about them. So it aligns very well with the tech conversation you were just saying.
Yeah. I'll have to look that up and see what tech company that was. And I honestly don't even know if it's a true story, but it sounds true.
It does sound true.
Yeah. And in the medical world, we know that a lot of things have been discovered via mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Like certain vaccines and various treatments for diseases have been discovered via a mistake.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about this during our first episode with you, David, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper. If there was somebody out there who was working for a corporation And they were really invested in their career at this corporation. They were really moving up the corporate ladder. But they were finding that there was no psychological safety present and being implemented at this corporation. Is there something that they can do? What kind of advice would you give to that person?
Similar to a lot of other things, if I had the opportunity, I would start with some questions that I want to understand what drives them and how do they feel as they're working towards that next level? How do they feel when they achieve that next level? And explore some of the things, like if money was no object, what would they be doing? Just to try to uncover what are some of the intrinsic things that drive them, because those tend to be really high, strong motivators for us. And what you're describing for somebody who's just trying to climb the corporate ladder, it feels very black and white. So there's an extrinsic motivator. There's rungs of a ladder you climb up, and from an outside perspective, without context, it might appear that that's the only thing that they care about. So I'd want to explore a little bit more with them first to see what really drives them. And in some cases, I know some people that climb the corporate ladder, that's all that matters. At least that's what they say. They don't admit to other underlying things. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, as long as they're not harming other people and they're creating the space for others to speak up. If they don't personally feel psychologically safe and they don't care, I don't know if I would push them to share more ideas. Because it needs to be genuine, and if it's not genuine, it's going to show up as superficial and fake. So if somebody really truly only cared, like their intrinsic motivation was aligned to their career, climbing the career ladder, I'd say, okay, go for it. And then I'd invite them as they go through that, as they go through their career ladder, to make sure they were creating safe spaces for others. So if it didn't matter to them, then it likely will matter to others, and to make sure that they're creating those safe spaces to speak up for those in their teams and those around them. On the other end of the spectrum, if what we find is that they're climbing the ladder, they're feeling a little bit lost in the pathway, and they don't feel psychologically safe, then that's a whole different conversation of like, how do you feel true to yourself and welcomed within this environment at the same time as you're climbing? And it could be challenging. And so I'd probably lead with that. And then the first thing I would probably share with them is a simple framework that I have in my book. It's called Invite, Share, Listen. And it's something that can show up in everything we do. So if they didn't feel psychologically safe at work, they could begin to invite, share, and listen. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in a moment. They could do this at home and just see how it feels to practice with a spouse or a friend or a family member, and just to start to explore it. How does it show up in a conversation? So, for example, I could go to my wife, and I'm making this up on the spot, but if I could invite a conversation around how can I better support her as she's a wonderful mom, wonderful wife, wonderful woman, and I could say, how can I better support you?
He's being recorded. He's got to say all this.
Exactly, but it's also
she's listening.
Yeah, you guys cut out all the parts that I say bad things, right? So, and then I can give her the space to share around what can I do to better support her. I can spend more time with the kids, even though we already split it 50-50. I could clean up after myself more often, whatever it is, and I can listen then, without the intent of being right about something or winning an argument or winning a conversation, but about truly understanding the perspective of the other person. And through that practice, I might start to develop more of around the skill set and the confidence to invite, share, and listen, create the space for them to share and then to listen. And then I could start to bring that to work. And if I have a friend or a confidant within work, I could start to practice and invite, share, and listen with them. And once I became comfortable with that, maybe I could even tell my manager, this is something I'm trying. Can we start to introduce this into our one-on-one conversations? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be something that shows up immediately and is hardcore and, putting a lot of pressure on yourself. You can kind of build the skill set as you go and can like continue in the spaces where you feel most safe. And hopefully that will open up other areas of safety and make you feel more confident in the conversation with others as you climb the ladder. It doesn't necessarily mean that others are going to be receptive to it. And that kind of goes back to how do you deal with a hierarchy or like with leadership who isn't interested. And that would bring me back to tying it into the goals that they have for themselves.
So I like that.
Yeah.
It's be the change you want to see, right? Is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. As a psychologist, I work with, I think that is one of the primary, deepest underlying fears is that, a client will come to therapy with that underlying feeling that they are not safe in practically everything that they do. And I think that comes down to, their primary caregivers and their relationship. And I deal a lot with attachments and attachment theory in my work to help people who come from anything but the secure attachment really understand and embody what it feels like to actually be safe and to be able to heal those attachment wounds. And I can imagine that, and maybe you touch on this in your book, that it's not just about psychological safety at work, it's about psychological safety in general. Tell our listeners how this concept of psychological safety can be broadened out to a person's life. Where will it come up? You just mentioned relationships, and that's a big one. But kind of give the listeners a little picture of what it's like outside of work.
Yeah. I think it shows up everywhere we are. And that's a very generic answer. But I'll bring it back to something more specific. Each of us feels psychological safety differently. So as a white, straight, upper middle class, cisgendered male, I am in a very different, I am more likely to feel psychologically safe and have had experienced psychological safety created for me, both within and outside of work, versus somebody who is from an underrepresented group. So I'll say a Black trans woman from a lower socioeconomic background. They're very likely to have a very different experience and that feeling of psychological safety than I am. And that transcends work. That shows up in everything we do. It shows up when you go to a restaurant or, just filling your gas and talking to somebody, or it's in every interaction. And so that's, I think it's almost difficult to say where psychological safety doesn't exist or where it doesn't play a role in our lives. And it's really important to recognize that in every experience we've had throughout our whole lives, it has created the safety that we feel right now. And we can change that over time. But acknowledging that and recognizing that, Chantal and Supatra, you probably have had different feelings around psychological safety than I have in my life. That allows us to have that conversation independent of the workplace, just as us as people, and how are we showing up and how are we treating others? Is that?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think, it does really depend on your background. It depends on what you were raised, what kind of environment you were raised in, what your experiences have been out in the world. And I think it is very different for women, especially women of color. I can, attest to that. And so can Chantal. It's like, what are we seeing from the world of men when we're out in public? What are we seeing from our childhood and what we grew up in? And I think cultivating safety, yes, it's important to have that out in and to promote it in the environment, but we can also create that within ourselves. And that can be through a lot of somatic exercises, a lot of mantra work, and resetting your nervous system around the concept of safety. And I think that that's so valuable. I do that all the time with my clients, and I can see, real true change happening when you change the internal environment as well.
That's it. Yeah. Sorry.
No, you know what I was gonna, when we were talking earlier, the idea of stress and everything that I talk about in my book and what Supatra often talks about it is so parallel and in line with what you talk about with psychological safety. As far as it being, outside of the workplace and in the real world, I kept thinking about the parent-child dynamic and that hierarchy that's naturally created and has to be there, quite honestly, right? If you, especially with young kids, and how it changes with all of their different phases from toddler to middle schooler to teenager, which is what I've got right now. Actually, I don't have a teenager. I have a 20-year-old now, so I have an adult. And that relationship and how psychological safety is so necessary to help a child have the kind of growth and happiness and health and sanity that they need. And when that's lacking, Supatra talks to people all day long who had that lacking in their childhood, so I'm sure I have a feeling you're a great dad.
I could actually, I think my kids are in the basement. They're all hiding downstairs to try to, not alone, they're with Colleen, to try to make sure it's quiet enough for this. We could call them up and ask, and they could give you a genuine response. I thank you for that. I'd say I do my best. But it is something that it shows up. I think about it and how I even respond to my kids. And actually, I want to come back to something in a minute around the physical side. But when Sierra she went to a horseback riding camp, and instead of me asking things like, "Did you like it?" I try to ask open-ended questions that allow her to explore it a little bit more. She's not always receptive, but like, what did you like most about it? Or how did you feel today? Or like those types of things that allow her to explore and share what she's feeling versus a yes, no question. So the stuff that I put in the book does show up in parenting. And I have had multiple people ask me if I'm writing a parenting book next. And I was like, I don't know if I'm as qualified for that one yet. Give me some time. I have a 7 and a 3-year-old. Give us some time and maybe that'll be next. I do want to come back to quickly because Supatra, you mentioned the work you can do for ourselves, and I think Chantal, you also called out in your book and earlier in the podcast around starting with ourselves. It really is why I started with ourselves, because if we can start to recognize and control those feelings, and maybe not control, but like acknowledge and give a voice to what we're feeling, it's such a great starting point. And I'll give a shout out to Chantal. So the trainings that I'm releasing, they all kick off with a mind-body exercise that pulled from Chantal's great book. And it helps us to get centered for that session and hopefully open our minds to some new ideas to practice. So it all flows together.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because you're bringing those workshops into companies, right?
I'm just starting now. So the full transparency, given that I split my work week 50-50 with Colleen, I have about 20 hours a week, which usually ends up narrowing down to about 15 hours. So I call out it's slow moving as I do this. But I had a company reach out to me about a month ago and asked me if I was ready to bring them. And so I'm leading one session with them in a couple of weeks. I'm going to officially announce them in the next week or two. But they're 7 one-hour sessions, and they range from what I think of more around the reflective and sharing side of psychological safety, around creating connection. So like personal storytelling, the activation of an invite, share, listen, those sit a little bit more on that side of reflection and sharing. And then go up through more direct applicability within the workplace. One of the sessions is around coaching. One of them is around feedback. And then I have 5 more that will come out in about 6 months, hopefully, that are even more directly aligned to how do you run a one-on-one meeting, a team meeting, how do you plan for the year, those types of things. All of them are 1-hour sessions designed to prompt a single skill that should be simple enough to go and practice immediately afterwards within the team. And the intent is to then bring that into everyday operations.
Great.
So valuable. I think that this is so important to bring into as many corporations as possible. So we want to make sure that these corporations know about you because we're almost out of time. Tell us how we can get a hold of you. How can we do these workshops? What's your website? What's your socials? All of that. How do people get a hold of you?
Sounds good. So I'll lead with email because it's the place that I check the most. So dave@thesafetyeffect.com. So the same as the book. The website is thesafetyeffect.com. And then also on LinkedIn. So I do my best to post there at least somewhat regularly. Thank you.
Yes.
So those are the best ways to reach me.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time for this amazing podcast. David, this is really valuable, and we feel really lucky that we have you on board because we cover all sorts of different aspects of health, and getting a perspective on the business world is something that's really valuable to us that we haven't been able to have on the podcast yet. And so we're really, really grateful to you and for you writing this book and helping to promote that psychological safety in the workplace. It sounds like you're also doing that within your family. And if we can all keep that in mind as we interact in the world, how important it is to create a safe environment for anyone who we come in contact with, I think the world would be such a better place to live. So thank you, David, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate both of you, and we've been looking forward to this for a while. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight podcast. We look forward to our next exciting interview, and we really hope you join us next time.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for tuning into the ANEW Body Insight podcast. Please remember, the content shared on this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. You can find us anywhere podcasts are streaming, on YouTube at my.anew.insight and at anew-insight.com under the ANEW Body Insight podcast tab. Follow us on our socials at my.anew.insight on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads for more updates. Tune in next time and evolve with us.